All right, take your text, The Basics of New Testament Syntax by Wallace. And we will have a happy Greek time now. Okay, person and number. A couple of characteristics of verbs. We're now in the verb section of the book, if you will notice. And a couple of characteristics of verbs, of course, is person and number. Characteristics of finite verbs. Any questions on the section on person? That's fairly straightforward, I think. Any hang-ups on that section or the section on number? You might make note of that chart on page 175 where he talks about the editorial we, the exclusive we, and the inclusive we. And understand that. That's interesting. I think the rest of it's fairly straightforward. Yes?
How many times in the New Testament is the we, I constructed? I mean, really, how many times is that used where they use we, the person, and mean just themselves?
Oh, the editorial use of
Yeah.
we? I would think it's, I mean, I don't know if rare is the right word, but I would not imagine it's used tons. But I don't know a specific answer to that.
It almost seems like a modern thing to do, but I don't know. Anyway, just in curiosity.
Well, I don't think it is. They're even in the Hebrew Bible, you have the plural of majesty. You know, so you have plurals used in different ways, and it's back to the illustration with the Queen of England. You know, the royal we. If she says we would like a cup of tea, she's not including you. You know. That means you should go get one cup of tea.
It's interesting though, on the exclusive we is when Paul uses that in he's not really naming people, but there are people with him. Or like in the book of Acts, I mean, Luke is writing, but he's writing about the group sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Right. We did this, we did that. It's kind of interesting in many of Paul's letters, he, it is ascribed to Paul and another person, Paul and Timothy. But you never say, you know, this is written by Paul and Timothy, you just say this is written by Paul. I wonder how much trouble we get into because of that, you know?
Same kind of an idea, I guess, when you look at Theophilus, that sometimes some people might look at that as more, not a singular person,
Right.
but like a characteristic of a believer, like someone who loves, a lover of God or whatever.
Right.
On the exclusive we, doesn't John do that a lot on 1 John? Where he's referring to himself and maybe the other apostles?
Yes, he does it in the first chapter at least.
I was just...
What we have seen and held and...
That was one of his illustrations. It
Yeah.
doesn't seem like...
Yeah, he does. All right, number. Any questions on number? All right, a couple more characteristics of verbals is voice and mood. Obviously, we're going to talk about tense later on. But voice and mood, we will talk about now. So, what is voice? Look at page 179. Voice is that property of the verb that indicates how the subject is related to the action or state expressed by the verb. So, how does the subject relate to the action of the verb? There are three voices. What are the three voices?
Negative.
Pardon?
Active, middle, and passive.
Active, middle, and passive.
There you go. Active, middle, and passive. So explain that. How does an active voice describe the relation of the subject to the action of the verb.
It's
It does the
continuing
action.
action.
It does the action.
All right?
Yes,
The subject
Performs,
is
produces, or experiences.
You know,
performing the action, okay? Passive.
The subject is receiving
Okay, the subject is acted upon.
Acted upon.
Middle.
and maybe
The
it's,
subject is doing the action to itself.
All right, that's one example. The subject doing the action to itself. You might say,
it's
I would
passive.
say, pardon?
It could be passive in that sense.
Well,
It's involved in the results.
no, that's not. I would say that the subject is somehow more intensely involved in the action of the verb. And one example of that would be the subject does something to himself or herself or itself. That's a reflexive middle, that's one example. But there are other ways that the subject can be more intensely involved in the action. We'll look at that. All right, so now that you understand what voice is, look at the top of page 180. There's a graph. I like his graphs, that's good. See, active, middle, or active, passive, and middle. All right, now, distinguishing middle from passive. The middle voice is tough for us English speakers because, or should we say tough for we English speakers?
The editorial way, I mean,
Yeah,
the
sort of
inclusive way.
Inclusive we, yeah. It's tough for us because we don't have a middle voice in English. So we learn by analogy, don't we? And so since there isn't anything analogous to the middle voice in English, then we kind of have to analogize around the barn a little bit, right? So it's harder for us. But how do you distinguish the middle from the passive? Number 3 on page 180. Only in the future and aorist tenses are there distinct forms for the middle and passive voice. In the present, imperfect, perfect, and pluperfect tenses, the middle and passive forms are identical. You get that? The middle passive forms are identical. Let me apologize in advance, but my mind could not help but go back to our discussion of cases, where he makes the point that case is a matter of form and not function. Well, he has to admit here that voice is a matter of function and not form. Well, all right, for whatever that's worth. So, in other words, there are ambiguous forms in present tense, imperfect tense, perfect, and pluperfect tenses. So how are you going to know whether it's a middle or a passive voice being used? Context. Your interpretation of context. Is there always agreement on those things? No, that's why we have different denominations in America today. We don't always agree on those things. All right, the active voice, the simple active, the subject performs or experiences the action. Then you have a causative action. I think that's pretty straightforward. His example, he scourged him. Well, Pilate didn't actually do the scourging, right? But he commanded it, he caused it to happen. Stative, active, the subject exists in the state indicated by the verb. And so we have love is patient, love is kind, or the first example, in the beginning was the word. So, you can probably argue that verbs of being don't have voice because it's not an action, it's a state, right? He's collected it under this category. Then there is the reflexive active. The subject acts on himself or herself. In such cases, naturally the reflexive pronoun is employed. So you have an active verb and a reflexive pronoun. So his bride has prepared herself. His bride prepared herself. Now the reflexive part does not come in the verb. The reflexive part comes in the pronoun. If the reflexive part were coming in the verb, we'd need a different mood there, voice. So what voice would we need if the reflexive part were going to come in the verb? Middle, that's right. So here's how to do a reflexive idea using the active voice and a reflexive pronoun. All right, questions? Good. Middle voice. Definition. Defining the function of the middle voice is not an easy task because it encompasses a large and amorphous group of nuances. Now, I love amorphous nuances, and we get a lot of them with the middle. In fact, an amorphous nuance is good fried with ranch dressing. But in general, in the middle voice, the subject performs or experiences the action expressed by the verb in such a way that emphasizes the subject's participation. That's good. The middle voice is emphasizing the subject's participation in the action of the verb. Or, as I said, it shows that the subject is somehow more intensely involved in the action of the verb than just a simple action. It may be said that the subject acts with a vested interest. Now, this is rather interesting here. Some of these verbs that mean one thing lexically in the active and something slightly different in the middle. He says, though these changes are not always predictable, such changes in meaning from active to middle usually make good sense and are true to the geniuses of the voices. So if you, if you take one lexical meaning of the root in the active, it's going to mean this, and it kind of makes sense that it means something slightly different in the middle, right? So, I means I take, but in the middle it means I choose or prefer. Can you see that? Can you see how the subject is more intensely involved in that action at that point? Or I remind, I remember. Apadidami, I give away. Apadidamai, I sell. Epikaleo, I call on. Epikaleamai, I appeal. See how that intensifies at that point? Echo, I have. Ekomai, I cling to. Krino, I judge. Krinomai, I bring a lawsuit. Kao, I stop. Kaomai, I cease. One intransitive, the other transitive. So the first one's transitive. That means I stop my car, for example. The intransitive one in the middle, I stop, implied, myself, right? Or we stop ourselves. So you have the middle concept there. And fulasso, to guard, and fulassamai, I am on my guard. All right, so you have, number one, a direct middle. That's fairly straightforward. He clothed himself. So the subject acts on himself or herself. Also referred to as a reflexive middle. All right, page 184, the indirect middle. I'm going to scoot by some of this stuff, but it's fairly straightforward, and I think you can understand it. The subject acts for, sometimes by himself or herself. You do something for yourself. But on page 185, the permissive middle, this is interesting. It says the subject allows something to be done for or to himself or herself. This usage, though rare, involves some exegetically important texts. A good rough and ready test is to translate the verb as a passive. If this makes sense, and if the notion of permission or allowance seems also to be implied, the verb is a good candidate for permissive middle. So an example, rise, have yourself baptized, and allow your sins to be washed away. Baptisai, apalusai, those are aorist middle imperatives, aren't they? Aorist middle imperatives. All were baptized into Moses. Now that's a passive translation, but the verb itself, being an aorist, is clearly a middle, isn't it? Right? All right, so permissive middle. Then there is a deponent middle. Now we learned about deponents way back in beginning Greek, right? Here's how he defines a deponent. A deponent middle is a middle voice verb that has no active form, but is active in meaning. That's where you typically find that defined in a grammar. I'd like to tweak that just a little bit and say that a deponent is a word that has no active form, but is active in translation. Because I would like to argue that even a deponent middle, you can usually see why the word is deponent. Erkamai, I come, I go. See how the subject is more intensely involved in that action? Because if I come and I go, I'm moving, maybe, right? See? So it makes sense that it's a middle, doesn't it? Now, that doesn't mean that it has to be, because eophon in the aorist, I came, I went, right, is not deponent. So it could be just an active voice kind of a thing. But when it is deponent and there isn't an active form, you can certainly see that that makes sense, right? And there's going to be a list of words that we're going to look at, and we will see. So, you've read that, you understand that. I think it's important to read and understand this paragraph. B, clarification 1, the basic principle is this: a deponent middle verb is one that has no active form for a particular principal part in Hellenistic Greek, and one whose force in that principal part is evidently active. Well, I don't see them as evidently active. And he uses this one. That's, for example, erchomai has no active form for the principal part, but it's obviously active in force. Well, I'm not so sure it's obviously active in force. Erchomai, I come, that's a middle idea, very easily. So I'd like to say it has an active translation. Why does it have an active translation? Not simply because we do not have a middle voice in English, so there's no middle voice that we can use in English. And it doesn't make sense to say I go myself. Right? Why? Because it's already understood. It's redundant, isn't it? Right? And then number 2, there are some verbs that never had an active form, yet the true middle force is clearly seen. For example, decamai. Now, most grammarians, or at least beginning grammars I've seen, all of them that I've seen would call decamai a deponent because there is no active form. And yet he's saying, oh, but we see a middle idea here. It's inherently reflexive, to receive, to welcome. Well, how's that any more inherently middle than I come or I go? You see. And I think this list of words is very instructive on page 186. I can see a middle kind of concept in all of these. Boulamai, right? To wish or will. Ginamai, to become. Dunamai, I am able. Ergodzamai, to work. You know, when I work, I'm real involved in that. You know, we talked about erchomai. Lampsamai, the second principal parts of the lambano. Now, lambano is active. I take, I receive. But I can also see how lampsamai, to take, could be seen as a middle. Peruamai, to go. Charizamai, to give freely. Following is a list of verbs that look deponent, but most likely or not, are naomai, to deny. Now, how is there more of a middle sense in to deny than to be able, for example, or to work? See? Aspadzamai, to greet, and so on. So you can see those. And make whatever sense of it you can, I suppose. All right, middle voice. Passive voice. Passive constructs. All right, passive with and without agency. Now, oftentimes when you have a passive construct, you have an agent described in the text, right? The ball was thrown by Bill. And by Bill describes an agent, doesn't it? But you can also have a lack of an agent. You can just say that, the ball was thrown. And that ball, get over here. That ball was thrown. We don't know who did it necessarily, or we're not saying who did it, so you can have it with or without an agent. But if you have agency, page 187, nice chart. The charts are worth the price of the book alone, aren't they? The chart here, the ultimate agent, the one who caused something to happen, hupa with the genitive, or if you believe in 8 cases, hupa with the ablative. Apa with the genitive, para with the genitive. And you can see opposite translation. Intermediate agent, dia, through or by. And impersonal means n with the dative, just the dative by itself, or ek with the genitive. Well, n with the locative, I would say. I'm sorry, instrumental. N with the instrumental and instrumental case by itself. Make sense? Or you have a date of an instrument or something like that. Notice that a person can be an impersonal means. Why? Because one person can use another person to accomplish something. But typically it's an inanimate object. Okay, so there's voice. Any questions on voice? That's pretty straightforward, I think. All right. Moods. We have 4 moods to be concerned with. And so you can see there is a chart that we'll get to on page 193. Before we get to that, though, let's look at the general definition of it. 192. Just as with tense, voice, mood, tense and voice, mood is a morphological feature of the verb. What does that mean? It's a morphological feature.
When they change,
Huh?
a feature that metamorphosizes or changes.
Well, yeah, sort of.
It's indicated by form.
That's right, it's indicated by form. Okay, so different moods will require different forms, typically of the endings of the verbs, always of the endings of the verbs. So, the mood is a morphological feature of the verb. In fact, when you finish this class, you should go put on your resume, read and understood this text, right? Because it's pretty impressive to be able to understand this, isn't it?
The abridged version.
Yeah, but yeah, you have to be honest and say the abridged version.
Well, for being honest,
Well, let's just
understood
read
most
that.
of it. Read and understood
Yeah.
most of it.
Or mostly read, mostly understood.
Well, yeah, mostly read, mostly, okay.
Some things I looked at but didn't know what they meant.
Remember you're on tape, so.
That's
All right,
okay.
voice indicates how the subject relates to the action or state of the verb. We talked about that. Tense is used primarily to portray the kind of action. In general, mood is a feature of the verb that presents the verbal action or state with reference to its actuality or potentiality. So we say that mood, it relates the action of the verb to reality. Is it presented as being real? Is it presented as being possible?
Yeah.
Is it presented as being probable? Or is it presented as being intended, a command? See what I mean? For the 4 moods. I say presented because, you know, I can use the indicative, which is the mood that expresses something as being real or according with reality, but it doesn't mean that it does accord with reality. I could say, the moon is made of cheese, and that's indicative, but it doesn't mean that it's reality. But I'm stating it as if it is reality. Neither does it mean that I believe that it's reality, right? Even though I'm stating it as such. So it is just that it is expressed as a reality. It is expressed as a probability. It is expressed as a possibility or an intention. All right, so you understand that? And he talks about that in that second paragraph on the top of page 193. So that you need to understand. So how the action of the verb relates to reality, but it is as the action of the verb relates to reality in the expression of the author, right? Not even in the mind of the author, necessarily, you see. And certainly not actually in reality. All right, so he says you have to look at mood on 2 different poles, top of page 194. In terms of actuality, you have the indicative mood. In terms of potentiality, the subjunctive, optative, and imperative mood. So if a verb expresses something in these 3 latter moods, these are potential actions, aren't they? Actions that may or may not happen in the future. On the other hand, there is another way to look at it, and that is that the indicative, optative, and subjunctive are cognitive kinds of moods, and the imperative is a volitional kind of mood, because it is command. You see. And so you can see, it's interesting, the statistics, how many times the indicative is used, subjunctive, imperative, and the optative. And the optative is only used 68 times in the New Testament. That's why we didn't bother memorizing the forms for the optative in beginning Greek. And you probably were at once joyful about not memorizing those and bothered by it because you didn't want to be incomplete in your knowledge. But for those 68 times, we'll deal with it. And the great thing is somebody orchestrating this? In our text today, we have one of those 68 optatives, don't we? So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so the indicative mood, page 195. Declarative indicative, that's just the normal run-of-the-mill indicative that you see. Interrogative indicative, you can have indicatives used in questions. But the conditional indicative, we'll take a look at that in a little bit more depth. Page 196. The indicative in conditions, this is a first-class condition. First full paragraph there, it says, the first-class condition indicates the assumption of truth for the sake of argument, while the second-class condition indicates the assumption of an untruth for the sake of argument. So, here we have an example. If they had known, implied but they didn't, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So, this is the first one, then would be a second-class condition. And the first one, if I cast out demons by Beelzebul, but I don't, by whom do your sons cast them out? All right. So the first class condition assumes the truth of the assertion for the sake of argument. It does not mean that the speaker necessarily believes it to be true. So that second example is a first class condition. Okay. Now, sometimes you have a first class condition, like in Philippians chapter 2, at the beginning of that. There are 4 of these in a row. If there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any affection and compassion, if there is any, what are the rest of it? No, that's later in Philippians. Fellowship of the Spirit.
And affection and mercy.
Yeah, that's pretty close.
That's the New King James.
Oh, the New King James.
Yeah.
Huh?
If there's any comfort in Christ, if any...
Yeah, if there's any encouragement in Christ, if there's any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if there's any affection and compassion or mercy, then make my joy complete. Now, you can take those as being true. You can even translate that since there is consolation of love, encouragement in Christ. So you can take that as the assumption of the reality of that condition. And that's a
first class condition.
Hmm?
And that is a first class condition.
Mm-hmm. Assume the truth for the sake of argument, but Paul is assuming the truth for the sake of argument because it is true. Right? All right. The potential indicative, which is kind of funny, because you'd think of a potential mood as not indicative. But here the indicative is used with verbs of obligation, wish, or desire, followed by an infinitive. So it is necessary to. So that's why you get the potential aspect. I want to pray. I want men to pray. Let's see. And so it's just a particular lexicography. It's a particular verb that expresses that kind of meaning by its definition. All right, cohortative or command indicative. The future indicative is sometimes used for a command, like you will go to bed now, like you say to your children. Right? And it's interesting that the 10 Commandments are expressed in that way. You will not murder. You will not commit adultery. You will not steal. You will not bear false witness. you will be holy because I am holy. So that's a strong kind of command. All right, and then the indicative with hati. We've seen this before. Hati functioning as quotation marks in a direct discourse. Yeah, direct discourse. Exactly. You can see an example on page 198. How does he say now? And in Greek, hati, but in English, quote, I have come down from heaven. Well, you can also have hati used in indirect quote, and again, context is going to help you, and the editorial marks in your Bible probably are going to help you, but those weren't there in the original, were they? Right? So you don't have to take those as inspired, but they will help you. Man.
How's your heart?
Man, it's hard to tell whether they're playing basketball or we're having a, terrorist attack or something.
I think it might be soccer tonight.
It sounds like. Are you serious?
I think it's soccer.
Oh my goodness.
It's a multi-purpose.
Do they do this every night?
Soccer?
Play in the gym?
Just Mondays. Just for us.
Just for a few moments.
They didn't like Tuesday.
We don't have a gym in Silver.
Did you hear that on the tape? Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you listening to us or are you listening to music?
I'm the same.
Oh, okay. So I wouldn't blame you if you're listening to me. All right, so hati can be used in an indirect quotation as well. Now, it's interesting in Greek, it works differently a little bit than the way it works in English for indirect quotations. And he gives you a graph of this on page 199. In English, how this works. Greek, if you go from direct quotation to indirect quotation, Greek retains the tense of the direct quotation in the indirect quotation. So if the direct quote is, he said, I see the dog, in Greek it would be, he said he sees the dog. Right? But in English it is, he said that he saw the dog. He said that in Greek it would be, he said that he sees the dog. Or in English it is, he said that he saw the dog. You see what I mean? So you need to understand the difference, because when we translate it, we translate it a little bit differently in English than what it appears in Greek. See what I mean? Indirect quotations. Any questions or confusion about that? All right.
So even in a formal equivalent translation, you still have to take into account, this is how we would say it in English.
Mm-hmm.
So you're gonna change the tense on it.
That's right. There's no such thing as a perfectly formally equivalent translation, because there can't be. No matter how hard you try, even if you said we're going to break the rules of English, it would be not understandable at points. Because no two languages ever correspond one to one, and so you're always on a continuum. You see, and if you go far enough one way in the continuum, you don't really have a translation anymore. You have a paraphrase. And you can only go so far in this way, or you don't have any sense in any translation you can make sense of, in the receptor language, right? So you're always somewhere not on either end of that continuum for a translation. So it's just do you want to snuggle up to this way, be more formally equivalent, or do you want to snuggle up to this way and be more dynamically equivalent, which means you're trying to get across the meaning of the text, not the form of the text so much. And here's the thing, and I think here's the thing you have to keep in tension in translation, right? That what are we after in translation? What's the point of translation? Well, the point of translation is to get the meaning of the text across. Right? That's the point. But having said that, I think that you cannot completely, at least sometimes, you cannot completely divorce, and I would argue that you can rarely, if ever, completely divorce meaning from form. Right? So, at the end of the day, we're after the meaning. but the meaning is, to some extent at least, always embedded in the form. So, where do you come out of that continuum? You know?
Managing tradition.
Yeah. So it becomes kind of a struggle.
I just think that the Pope will tell us what it all means.
Well, the good thing about this is that's why we need preachers, because you can spend you can fruitfully spend an amount of time in your preaching and teaching in church, conveying the meaning of a text that a simple translation could never convey. Because when you've got to pick between a particular word and a particular phrasing for a translation, right? You're limited. That only gets across a certain amount of the meaning. But when you can spend 5 minutes explaining it and illustrating it, that's job security right there.
I had one yesterday in Philippians 4, when Paul said, "Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account." It almost sounds like an agricultural metaphor, but it's not. The word fruit, it was a business term, it's a commercial term. I seek the dividends that come to your account, but when you're reading this translation, New King James, you don't get that necessarily.
Is the word karpos?
No.
It's not? See, there you go. The man's preaching from his Greek New Testament and he's feeding the flock.
Who's go wrong? Never read it.
I don't think so.
You preached from Philippians 4 yesterday?
Yeah.
Me too. Only I was in the first 7 verses.
Oh, I was in.
We're going through Philippians too.
Huh?
We're going through Philippians too.
Is that right?
We're in chapter 2.
What's the verse?
'Tis the season for Philippians. It's good.
Oh, it is carpon. Tom carpon. But it was used in the commercial language of the day.
Like a dividend. How about that? That's pretty cool. All right. Indicatives used with hati. Top of 200, you can see the indicative of apposition. A lot of times if you can read the example, it gives it to you. Do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you. So the spirits are subject to you is a redefinition or re-explaining of in this, isn't it? So just like we had nouns of apposition, the king, my father, king and father are in apposition to one another. Now we can have a whole dependent clause in apposition to something in the sentence. Do you see that? Do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you. All right, then we have the exegetical use of the indicative. And you see that term in grammars all the time, exegetical, and that means that it explains, as if it's right here, explains, clarifies, or completes a previous word or phrase. This is similar to the appositional hati clause, except that the exegetical hati clause does not identify or name, but instead explains its antecedent, cannot be substituted for its antecedent, and can explain or complement something other than a substantive. In some instances, especially after a substantive, the gloss, to the effect that, brings out the explanatory force of the hati clause. So, who is this man that he commands even the winds and the sea, or both the winds and the sea, and they obey him? So, exegetical. Who is this man? Now, describing the man, this one. You can have a causal hati, because, blessed are the poor in spirit, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Kind of interesting that deals with this under the indicative. You could deal with it under hati, couldn't you? You could deal with it under conjunctions, but in any case, that's the indicative mood. Subjunctive mood. Subjunctive is the most common of the oblique moods in the New Testament. In general, the subjunctive can be said to represent the verbal action or state as uncertain but probable. So, in classical Greek, Attic Greek, there's still overlap between the optative and the subjunctive, but the optative was used a lot more than the subjunctive, and the subjunctive less. In New Testament Greek, Koine Greek, the subjunctive is used almost exclusively, and the optative is almost dropped out. Again, that's just simplifying of the language. Well, a lot of people are using it who have a different language as their first language, so it ends up simplifying Greek. All right, if you look on page 202, it talks about the subjunctive in relation to the imperative. It says, in sum, the subjunctive is used to grammaticalize potentiality. It normally does so in the realm of cognitive probability, but may also be used for cognitive possibility, overlapping with the optative, or volitional intentionality, overlapping with the imperative. So in independent clauses, you may have a hortatory subjunctive. Now this we saw in beginning Greek, right? Translated to let us, and we saw that. You may have a deliberative subjunctive. That is a subjunctive in questions. And you may have a subjunctive in a real question or a rhetorical question. He lines it out again, page 203. We get a graph. All right. So we have the first example from Matthew 6:31. Do not be anxious, saying, what should we eat? Or what should we drink? Or what should we wear? Now he would classify those as a real question. Whereas in the next example, they said to him, should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And he's saying that's a rhetorical question. In the chart, a real question answers the question, is it possible? And a rhetorical question answers the question, is it right? And you can see that in these two questions. Okay. So subjunctive, this is the thing to concentrate on. Subjunctives used in questions. And sometimes questions can be rhetorical questions, can't they? All right, so then there's,
Question.
pardon?
That was a rhetorical question.
That was a rhetorical question. That's right. All right, page 204, emphatic negation with the subjunctive. May, and the subjunctive is how you do emphatic negation. And then prohibitive subjunctive is simply that, the use of the subjunctive in a prohibition. Example, do not be amazed. And what negative would you use? May, with the subjunctive always. You remember that. All right, independent or subordinate clauses. You have the conjunction in conditional sentences. And he's going to go back later in the book, and oddly enough, I just turned to the page. He's going to go back and talk about conditional sentences in and of themselves, so that they're not all strung out through the different moods. But you can have a subjunctive used in a conditional sentence. This is the use of the subjunctive in the protasis of conditional sentences. The conditional element is made explicit by the particle on. So that's just a with the particle on attached to it, isn't it? Now, a conditional sentence has a protasis and an apodosis. Right? He's been using these terms here. The protasis speaks the condition, and you can remember it because pro means it comes first, right? So, if blah, 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 then, we're talking about if-then sentences, right? if blah 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 protasis, then blah 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 apodosis. All right?
Is it only going to be the fulfillment of the condition? The positive?
Well,
It's a condition that was first spoken.
yeah, but there are conditional sentences that aren't complete in the New Testament. But if it's complete, yeah, then it's going to relate in that way. One of the Hebrew idiomatic ways of saying it's never going to happen is like, is to use the first half of the protasis of a conditional sentence. If you ever see my rest, God says to Israel, that means there's not going to be any way you're ever going to see my rest. That's an idiom, it's not an English idiom. Okay, so if you have eon with the subjunctive in the protasis, then you have a third-class condition. Right? It's also possible to have a fifth-class condition. So look where it says the first word is semantically, right about in the middle of page 205. Talking about third and fifth class conditions. Semantically, their meaning is a bit different. So now we've had first class, second class, third class, and fifth class condition and so forth. The third class condition encompasses a broad range of potentialities in Koine Greek. It depicts what is likely to occur in the future, what could possibly occur, or even what is only hypothetical and will not occur. The fifth class offers a condition, the fulfillment of which is realized in the present time. So here we go. If you look at the example, Matthew 4:9, I will give you all these things if you will fall down and worship me. Now, here the if clause is second, and of course you can do that, right? It's still the protasis, and the first part is still the apodosis. So you can't put the then, although you don't say then if it comes first, right? But you can put the then clause first, and the if clause second. But this is it wasn't really potential because Jesus isn't going to do it, but it's expressed as potential. If you fall down and worship me, then I will give you all these things. Okay, that's your third class conditional sentence.
But the process is switched with the right.
Yeah, I mean,
Because the if is the
the if clause is the second one in this case, and you can do that. You can switch the order. It's just kind of a reversed order from what we might normally see.
Yeah, because the positive is always states a condition.
Yeah, the if clause is always the protasis, and it typically goes first. If you do this, then, and that's why they call it an if-then kind of thing. But you can't use then if the then statement comes first, right? Then you will. I imagine you could. Then I will give you all these things if you. But it's doesn't sound as good. Okay, second example. If I bear testimony about myself, my testimony is not true. If I bear testimony about myself, my testimony is not true. So the present tense in the apodosis permits this to be taken as a fifth class condition. In context, it seems to be the best option. Jesus is not saying that it is probable that he will bear testimony about himself, rather simply stating a supposition. So that, if I bear testimony about myself, that would relate to a current condition, wouldn't it? All right, now, page 206, hina and the subjunctive. Now, hati is used with the indicative, isn't it? Hina is used with the subjunctive. So the single most common category of the subjunctive in the New Testament is after hina, comprising about 1/3 of all subjunctive instances. There are 7 basic uses included in this construction: purpose, result, substantival, epexegetical, complementary, and command. Purpose and result are awfully close, aren't they? Sometimes you can see purpose clearly, and sometimes you can see result clearly, but he's recognizing sometimes you really can't distinguish the result between purpose and result. So he has a purpose-result together category. All right, so you see purpose. What must I do in order that I might be saved? See, for the purpose of being saved. Then he gives the purpose-result. He seems to skip the result, doesn't he? Then 3, the substantival hina clause. my food is in order that I do the will of the one who sent me. Now, you see how that's working? The whole hina clause is working as the predicate nominative, I guess you could say. And so it's working like a substantive. The whole hina clause is operating like a substantive. All right, the complementary hina completes the meaning of a helping verb. So just as you wish, literally, in order that in order that they do to you, men. So just as you want men, in order that men might do to you, you do likewise to them. That's kind of awkward in English, isn't it? Get the idea, the complementary hina. Helping, used to complete a helping verb. All right. Now you have the subjunctive of verbs of fearing. You could note that. Subjunctive and indirect questions. We had indirect discourse, indirect quotes. Now we can have indirect questions. They have already been with me for 3 days, and they do not have anything to eat. Already 3 days, they are remaining with me, and they are not having what they might eat. And notice that T is the interrogative T, isn't it? So that's an indirect question.
Yes.
All right, now the subjunctive in indefinite relative clauses. The subjunctive is frequently used after hostis or hos on. The construction normally indicates a generic or sometimes an uncertain subject, hence the particle of contingency and the need for a subjunctive. So when you have the idea of contingency, you're going to expect a subjunctive, aren't you? And really the particle, the presence of on or on, whatever, that alpha nu particle, it's contingency, doesn't it? So whenever you have that, you're expecting a subjunctive mood verb. All right, the subjunctive in indefinite temporal clauses. Again, whenever you have, whenever, or something like that, then you expect a subjunctive. All right, so there you go, subjunctive. Now the optative mood, the voluntative optative, the optative used in wishes, and there you go. So it seems to me we have a 1, we don't have a 2. So you have a 1 without a 2. All right, finally the imperative mood. Obviously the imperative of command is pretty straightforward, but you also have the imperative of prohibition. Now it's worth reading that paragraph. The imperative is commonly used to forbid an action. It is simply a negative command, and may, or cognative may, is used before the imperative to turn the command into a prohibition. Almost all instances in the New Testament involve the present tense. So if you're going to use an imperative as a negative command, it's going to be a present imperative, almost certainly in the New Testament. The aorist is customarily found as a prohibitive subjunctive. So, sometimes, if the context permits, if you have a present tense with the imperative in a negative, you might translate that, stop doing something. Do not continue to do whatever. So, stop. And I think in 1 John, stop loving the world, either things in the world. Right? If you have an aorist subjunctive for a prohibition, you might get the idea there, depending on the context, don't start doing this. Don't begin to do this. And the aorist is typically more emphatic in some contexts as well. You might see that it's almost like a sergeant barking a command. An aorist subjunctive. So that's the way that works out. You have an imperative of request. Why? Well, sometimes you actually have imperatives. Even in the Lord's Prayer, you have imperatives. let your kingdom come, let your will be done, give us our daily bread, give us today our daily bread. Those are imperatives, but they're imperatives of entreaty, right? They're used with the force of a request and not a command. Obviously, when we're praying, we're not commanding something to God. All right. And then you have the conditional imperative. The imperative may at times be used to state a condition on which the fulfillment, hypothesis of another verb depends. So if you look at the example, ask, that's an imperative, and it will be given to you. That's the same thing as saying, if you ask, it will be given to you. See? Okay, that's as far as we go tonight. Any questions? You should take a look at the cheat sheet in the back, page 3. 325. 325. Number, person, number, voice, active, middle, passive, mood, indicative, subjunctive, optative, imperative. So there you go then. Any questions? All right, let's